Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Great to hear from from the Brazilian Data Protection Authority there about what they're doing in terms of ensuring sort of data flows internationally while ensuring privacy and security. It's not easy, of course. So now we're on to we heard a bit about the question of trust in the panel on AI early on. It's right at the heart of all of these conversations. So the next panel is focusing on navigating trust and risk, and we're delighted to be joined by a panel of expert speakers. Sandra Särav, who's the Deputy Secretary General for Business and Consumer Environment from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications of the Republic of Estonia. We'll also be joined by Brando Benifei, who's the member of the European Parliament, who's the co-rapporteur for the Artificial Intelligence Act. Monika Adamczyk is cybersecurity expert at the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. Christiane Wendehorst from the European Law Institute, she's the scientific director there. And another expert speaker, Mark Cankett, who's the regulatory assurance partner at Deloitte. And this panel will be moderated by Akash Guglani, who's Senior Policy Associate from the Digital India Foundation. So over to you, Akash, and to the esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Warm welcome to this exciting panel on consumer risks and trust. We have an exciting panel to discuss this. So, on consumer risk and trust, there are different legislative and regulatory pathways from different territories, from European legislations to American regulations to Chinese regulations. In this panel, we'll try to discuss and navigate how different geographies and territories and policymakers can learn from each other to navigate, to understand the concerns of consumer trust and risks, and how can businesses, governments, and citizens at large can navigate their digital journeys. To begin, let's just dive in to this important session. I have a fantastic panel, and Mr. Brando Benifei will be joining us soon. So why don't we start with Professor Christiane Wendehorst? Professor Wendehorst, you have worked extensively with the European policymakers. Can you give us an overview of what is happening in Europe with regard to consumer trust?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to this marvelous panel. In fact, Commissioner Reinders has already listing all the activities of the EU this morning. And it's really amazing what the EU has been doing in the area of consumer trust recently. It started, one could say, with the General Data Protection Regulation in 2016. Then we had a whole bunch of consumer contract law legislation coming around in the year 2019, to name just the Consumer Digital Content and Services Directive and the Sale of Goods Directive, which made sure that consumers have the same level of protection if they buy digital products and digital services as they have with tangible goods. And it also made sure that consumers have the same level of protection, irrespective of the fact whether they pay with money or with data. There was also the Modernization Directive, which made sure that consumer legislation across the board is updated to the digital age. We've then seen in the year 2022 the two big pieces of platform regulation that have been mentioned on today's panels various times, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And for consumers, it's in particular the Digital Services Act that has brought about major protective mechanisms, from content moderation to transparency in advertising to protection against dark patterns on online interfaces. We've seen enhanced measures to protect children. We've seen enhanced measures to provide consumers with better choice and better overall protection. And there are special rules in particular for the very large online platforms, which are subject to enhanced scrutiny. Then there is, of course, also a new batch of legislation, such as the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, the European Health Data Space. The Data Governance Act is already there. The other two are still in the pipeline. And those pieces of legislation are, if you like, at the interface of data protection, consumer protection, and the data economy. So the data economy is getting more and more important, and so it's really of the essence to get the two, data protection and consumer protection on the one hand, and the data economy on the other hand, aligned. And then we have, of course, the topic of the last panel, which is artificial intelligence legislation, with the draft Artificial Intelligence Act, but with also a revised product liability directive that puts a stress on digital products, including AI, and a draft AI liability directive. And so we've seen at the last panel how important this really is, and that it's so important for consumer trust to do something about artificial intelligence. So it's really good to see that the EU is taking action and in many, many areas taking the lead. Of course, if you enact such a wide array of legislation in such a short period of time, there is always a danger of moving too fast, maybe, and also, of course, of creating inconsistencies here and there. So it might now or in the very near future be good to pause for a moment and to reflect which regulatory models have been the most successful and which maybe have been proved less successful, and also to look abroad, because now we see many countries in the world, many regions in the world taking action in the relevant fields. And I think it's the perfect time now for an international dialogue, as we see at this RAID conference, to compare the various approaches and to compare the protective mechanisms that have been put in place or that are being discussed in different regions of the world. And it's also, of course, of the essence to have the courage and be prepared to rethink approaches that have been taken. So I'm really thrilled to be on this panel and to hear also from other speakers what is going on in other places of the world.
Let me loop in Ms. Monika Adamczyk. As a cybersecurity expert, how will you describe the relationship between trust and risk? What is that definition and apparatus look like?
Um, the relationships actually is very strong and very direct, although for many people this may not be that clear. The reason why there is a strong relation between trust and risk, because if we are speaking about consumer trust, if we want our consumers to trust the products, the IT products, that means that those products need to have an adequate level of security and personal data protection. And in both cases, to implement the appropriate level of security, to implement the appropriate level of data protection, the approach that has to be adopted is a risk-based approach. No one in the world, not even the richest organization, have unlimited budget for security and data protection. And this is why a risk-based approach is the best way to assess and evaluate what are potential vulnerabilities, what are potential threats against the systems, and how to adequately address them. Which is why, as I said, it is, of course, excellent news that there are so many policies which define requirements that are associated with ensuring consumer trust. However, it's a first step in a long path to ensuring the trust is being maintained, and the actual implementation of security measures, security controls is what supports those policies, what supports those legal requirements in the actual delivery of sufficient level of security and data protection for our consumers.
perspective. So now let me get Ms. Sandra Särav. We did get some overview from Professor Wendehorst and some definitional understanding from Ms. Adamczyk. So let me ask you this. We get some perspective on, let's say, European regulations. How do you see Chinese regulation compare with what is happening in Europe? And what is, let's say, Estonia's take on Chinese companies, how they navigate this path?
Thank you so much, and interesting take you're giving me. Well, when it first comes to Chinese regulation, I mean, let's take a company we all know, and what most of the European and global consumer uses, namely TikTok, which at one point, I'm not sure if this is still the statistics, had even more users than Instagram, for instance, which would have been, unexpected a couple of years ago, but this is the reality now. So if we look at regulating TikTok in China versus in Europe, in China, the content is heavily censored. That is actually shown to the kids. And the material that is shown to the kids is mainly educational. Versus in Europe, the algorithms that are behind TikTok are mostly to keep users on the platform, which is, of course, their core business model. And this is what we figure those types of social media companies do. They need to get more FaceTime with people so they can sell them more ads. So actually, when we look at the Digital Services Act of Europe, China has kind of a similar regulation locally. So they are also trying to very heavily regulate what types of ads are shown to the consumers. So we can say that Chinese local regulation is quite similar to what the EU has. We have consent-based advertising. For instance, Internet of Things devices should not show ads to users without their permission. And it's very much limited to what the kids can see on their platform. So in a way, they're trying to do what we are trying to do to protect our consumers. It's just that this product shows different type of content outside of China and shows different type of content within China. And now many Western countries, starting with the US, moving to Canada, to Australia, to several European governments, already perhaps a year ago with the UK, are limiting the use of TikTok. But they're mostly limiting the use of TikTok for government officials. So they don't want to have this app in the government officials' phones because it's not sure where the data is stored, which brings us to the core idea of data protection. And I think the governments in Europe and in Western countries are very much realizing that this is a question of limiting freedom of speech, limiting access to certain apps, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Pinterest, or any meta services from Instagram to WhatsApp. And so freedom of speech on one hand, accessing those apps, and the other side also censorship. And of course, European countries are taking the stance that we're not going to block something if it's still legally operating. But there are some concrete examples how we have blocked services, including in Estonia. For instance, after the war broke out in Ukraine, after Russia attacked Ukraine, and it was clear that Yandex, a ride-hailing platform from Russia, was actually sharing data of European citizens, including Estonian citizens, and stored it in the Russian territory, then Estonia decided that we are going to sanction this service, and we're not going to allow such a service to offer their products or services in the Estonian territory if the data is actually being shared outside of Estonia. So there are different types of approaches we can take to foreign technologies, a data protection aspect, security aspect, and data flows aspects. But we always have to bear in mind the idea of freedom of speech and censorship.
Thank you, Sandra, for such a broad overview of different issues in Chinese regulation and European regulations. And similarly, in India also, we have banned TikTok specifically due to these security concerns. So I think there are broad kind of international consensus on these. So let me get from, let's say, European, Chinese to Estonian perspective. Let me get some business perspective from Mark Cankett. So Mark, we have heard something from Professor Wendehorst about the larger European regulations, from Ms. Adamczyk about the consumer trust and the relationship, from Sandra, the comparison. Let's just get a business perspective. How do you think audit assurance, which you work in, play a part in building consumer trust and protection for consumers and businesses at large?
Yeah, thanks very much. And just to say very quickly, it's great to be part of such a knowledgeable and illustrious panel today. So thank you for the invitation. To your question, I believe audit, or in other words, assurance, is a valuable tool to increase trust. Indeed, its key purpose is to build trust and confidence in markets and with a variety of stakeholders. Increasingly, assurance is becoming something that's seen as more than something that's just suitable for financial figures, for example, the annual report of a firm, but also a tool that can be used to enhance stakeholder confidence in a wide variety of areas, including regulation. And we've seen the European Commission, sort of take this position with the introduction of specific audit requirements within the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Assurance provides users of that assurance with increased confidence in the subject matter under review, through having another set of eyes, a fresh set of eyes, as it were, review and challenge the content, the objectives, description, numerical accuracy, whatever it is of the information. And in the case of the DSA, this may be about building confidence in the design of controls that management asserts ensures compliance with that regulation. As a tool, audit and assurance also provides the organisation subject to it with an additional motivation to ensure their information and approach is transparent, it's justified, and it's clearly articulated. So organisations that are preparing for the likes of the DSA and the DMA obviously shouldn't underestimate the work required to achieve this transparency and clarity of articulation in respect of their controls. However, I believe if it's done right and well, this will enhance the confidence and trust of others, both outside the organisation, but also within the organisation who, for example, aren't day-to-day compiling, preparing, or operating the subject matter under audit, such as the controls, but those individuals who are ultimately responsible, for example, senior management. So I think, to your question, audit and assurance is a key tool in the overall trust ecosystem, but with the benefits that it brings, that there are a number of key points of consideration that I'd like to just highlight. I think one of those is around being clear from the outset what the intent and objectives of the assurance is. And for that, we need to consider the users of the assurance to help us shape and scope the work. In terms of the DSA audit, those users include the Commission, but on the basis that these reports are to be made freely available, also the general public, which increases the complexity of the exercise. Another point is to consider that there are a range of assurance approaches available, from standards-based assurance, for example, under an international standard with accreditation for the firm or team members conducting the work, through to more bespoke procedures tailored to a particular application or use case, based perhaps on an auditor's own view of what good looks like. So I think the key point here is there is scope for an expectation gap to emerge unless everybody is clear on what constitutes audit and assurance under a particular use case. So, for example, what is the appropriate audit approach under the Digital Services Act? This is something I've been focusing on quite heavily. I guess in the context of trust and building confidence, we also need to consider the level of confidence that is sought. So put another way, by how much do we need to increase the level of confidence that users, such as the Commission or the general public, have in the information, for example, the design of controls at a platform company, for them to trust it appropriately? Is this by a marginal amount, or is this by a significant amount? And that will play directly into the assurance approach adopted, for example, the amount of testing that's undertaken. Now, there are lots of other consideration points that are being grappled with. For example, as part of the DSA audit requirement, is this point in time assurance? Is it through the period? How do we want to report? What's the best way to communicate to users on the results of the assurance? What skills are needed? How much time and budget is available, etc. And I'm happy to expand on all of this, but I guess my advice to anyone who's obviously preparing for assurance or contemplating it is to consider all the points I've raised carefully before embarking. If you will be subject to audit under the DSA, consider how you need to get ready across preparing your audited information, aligning roles and responsibilities, establishing appropriate governance, etc. And it can sound daunting when you look at the breadth of regulation that's coming through in the internet space and even the DSA itself. But the outcome should be enhanced trust and confidence, from which comes significant value for both the firms subject to audit, but also the users of that assurance.
Thank you, Mark. That was such an interesting insight on what's the applications of these costs, these regulations on businesses, on people. So to understand this much deeper, let me get Professor Wendehorst to explain what are these different risk-based approaches. What are these models in, let's say, in DSA, in AI Act, in GDPR? Let's say one of the cases people usually ask is DSA looks at the size of the company, whereas AI Act ignores the size. So what are these different risk-based approaches which impacts businesses, governments, and also citizens like us?
The risk-based approach. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that great question. And it really links back to what Monika said before about the risk-based approach being so important for getting regulation right. And in fact, we see very different notions of what it means to take a risk-based approach across the different pieces of legislation. So let us start with the GDPR. So we often read that the GDPR takes a risk-based approach. However, if you look at it more closely, it's not so very risk-based, I have to say. We do see a number of provisions in the GDPR that reflect a proportionality principle that's clear. But in other places, we see also a very, very rough typology being taken. For example, the typology, whether data is particularly sensitive, whether you have particular categories of data under Article 9, or whether you have just normal personal data. So that is a very, very rough category, and there may be sensitive data that are whose disclosure is not at all creating a huge amount of risk, and we may see other than sensitive data whose disclosure will really pose a great risk to individuals. And also, there are other examples where the GDPR doesn't really look at the concrete risk created by data use. So the whole arsenal, if you like, of obligations and restrictions applies across the board, even for the most innocent types of data use, such as a local football club or a parents' association at school. So the idea, of course, is that all processing of personal data is potentially sensitive, as you can never know how data will be combined and used later on. So I fully understand that starting point, and in principle, it's a good starting point. However, we may need to reflect whether a little bit more of a risk-based approach could be introduced in the GDPR. If we look at the AI Act, the mechanism is an entirely different one. So there we have this, you see this risk pyramid. I'm sure you've seen pictures of that risk pyramid, which the European Commission took as a starting point, where you have at the top of the pyramid very few prohibited AI practices that are prohibited because they pose an unacceptable risk. Then you have high risk AI applications that pose a high risk to individuals, to society, and potentially also the environment. And then you have transparency risk AI applications, and many apply applications that pose only a minimal risk and are therefore not subject to specific regulation. And so when it comes to those high-risk AI systems, which are at the core of the AI Act, you look at the area or sector in which an AI application is used, and then you look at the type and purpose. And we just heard in the previous panel that the European Parliament is suggesting, on the one hand, to add another filter and only consider as high-risk AI systems that really do put a significant risk for individuals or society. And they also, on the other hand, want to enlarge the list of prohibited AI practices and of high-risk AI systems. So we will see where that would end up, but to sum up, the AI Act looks very much at the area in which something is used and the particular application, and at whether an application poses a risk in the individual situation. And for the DSA, as you already mentioned, and also that holds true for the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, by the way, a main criterion is size. So how big is a company and how many users does a platform have? Because evidently it makes a difference whether as a platform you have 1,000 users or 1 million users or maybe 1 billion of users. So that has an influence on the risk. So many provisions do not apply for micro and small enterprises, and there are additional obligations for those very large online platforms, the VLOPs, so to say. And we have, for example, a scheme of how to assess and mitigate systemic risks. Now, I think when we look at these different approaches to risk-based, then I think it's time to compare them and to discuss whether maybe some of the models that have been developed in the context of the DSA or the AI Act might also be made fruitful for the GDPR, for example, in order to make sure there is no paralyzing effect on the economy and civil society in cases where really the risk is very low. On the other hand, the AI Act doesn't look sufficiently at the size, but it makes a huge difference whether recruitment software, for example, is only used by a handful of businesses, whether it's used by 20% of the market, or whether it's suddenly used by 80% of the market. Because if a recruitment software is used by 80% of the businesses that do recruitment, then suddenly, if there is a bias, this may mean that particular individuals no longer have access to the employment market. So size and the market coverage is a very important factor. And so I think this should have been looked at more closely in the AI Act. So to sum up, I think it's really time to compare the different approaches, to also compare it, and I'm repeating myself, with approaches taken in other regions of the world, and then look at how things can be here or there improved in the future when the acts are being revised, as is regularly the case in the EU. Thank you so much.
Dive into different risk-based approaches. So let me come to Ms. Adamczyk. Let us define risk in a broader arena. These are regulatory risks. These are different steps which Professor Wendehorst explained. But let's say most of the data processing happens through satellites. Most of the our data economy runs through these satellites hovering over of the world. We have underground, undersea cables which process most of our data. And we have seen in COVID how supply chain they get disrupted. The risks just get enhanced and they get into different areas. So my question to you is, what are the risks associated with these satellite communications, these broad areas where different countries, different businesses interact with each other?
The answer to this question is not very simple, because maybe first allow me to respond to what Christiane has said about different approaches. I mean, to a certain extent, she's right, but also from technical perspective, from cybersecurity perspective, approach to risk-based approach is fairly common one. What differs is the scope of a risk assessment. Because for those who are not familiar what risk is effectively evaluating, assessing whether certain adversary or negative event would happen. So we're assessing probability of such a negative event and what is potential impact. And then when it comes to the impact, we also have to have a very clear understanding from what perspective we're looking at this impact. And this is also maybe why actually I like the fact that in GDPR it is called data protection impact assessment. Although for many people that actually sounds like more of document type of activity where we go through a processing operation and just look at certain things. We fill a form and then we consider, okay, we've done the data protection impact assessment and we comply with the law, where effectively methodologies for performing risk management, and I'm calling this for a reason, risk management, are very, very common, regardless whether we are performing risk assessment in satellite infrastructure, where we do this for undersea cables, or whether we, for example, trying to assess a risk and impact for data subjects whose data is being processed in a mobile application, a consumer application. So those methodologies, the actual techniques are very, very similar, and they can be used as long as the context of the risk assessment is being defined and the criteria which are being used. And then, of course, as long as we know whether we look at the risk from the perspective, for example, of an organization or, for example, consumers. Now, going back to the original question, what are the risks associated with processing a large amount of data for different type of telecommunication infrastructure? Those risks could be associated with such fact that a lot of this infrastructure relies, for example, on legacy technologies. On the fact that access to this infrastructure, whether these are satellites or undersea cables, is difficult. Once, for example, a satellite is being launched, replacing a defective component or pushing a software upgrade may be either very difficult or just impossible if it's, for example, a physical component, not a software component. When we rely on digital technology, on digital exchange of information in every aspect of our economy, having a communication that works not only from, let's say, my current place of work to, I don't know, a location, physical location that is just across the city in which I currently reside, but also this needs to work, across the entire world. So obviously there are cyber attacks that would target different type of telecommunication infrastructure, could affect daily work, could affect also a lot of critical infrastructure, could affect emergency services. They could create a lot of either physical events that could have that could pose a serious threat to society, to specific group of people or specific organizations. Effectively, when we are talking about the different risks which are associated with telecommunication infrastructure, they are to a certain extent similar to risks that we know that are associated with a traditional IT infrastructure. It just, depending how many of the users or how many of the end systems rely on this infrastructure, on the satellite infrastructure or undersea cables, its impact and scope could be different. That's why what I said at the beginning, and I will just repeat it. It is extremely important that we think about risk as one of the starting and first elements that needs to be considered in developing and designing and developing any of the IT systems. And that's why we have to basically always remember that security by design, privacy by design, or data protection by design, as it is being called in GDPR, is something that must basically be taken under consideration. Now, one other thing that at the end I would like to mention is that European Commission has recently published the Space Strategy for Security and Defense, where it actually raises an issue of security as extremely important, especially security in space systems. USPA, the EU Agency for Space, is the main organization that is being tasked with implementing the strategy. However, ENISA is also explicitly mentioned supporting USPA in these activities, and definitely in the foreseeable future, there will be a lot of activities done in the area of clearly defining cybersecurity requirements for satellite systems for commercial providers of satellite services and products.
Thank you for that kind of technical broad overview. And in India also we have this, we call it technical legal approach, where you provide technical architecture to resolve some sort of trust issues, and you also have regulations. So let me come to Ms. Shara. Uh, I think this question is more like forecasting. Do you think these European regulations can become like DSA, DMA, the AI Act, could be like global trendsetters like GDPR?
Thank you for this question. I have quite a frank opinion on it, so I'm happy you asked me. So definitely, I mean, when we look at the GDPR, when it came out, there were way less than 100 countries in the world globally which had any type of data protection regulation in place. I believe the number was around 50. And now we are way over 100 because the EU made it clear. If you want to offer your services within the EU, you have to become compliant with our legislation, that is the GDPR, that is the most overwhelmingly in-depth data protection regulation in the world. And we did not only say that you have to follow the legislation when you want to offer the services to our EU citizens who are located in the EU. We also said if you want to do business with our citizens that involve any type of personal data sharing, you have to provide adequate or equal level of protection to the users as if you were serving them in the EU. And this has been apparent through several European Court of Justice's decisions, mainly thanks to Max Schrems. So yes, GDPR was definitely a trendsetter. Now, if you ask me if the other pieces of legislation are going to be a trendsetter, I am a bit more skeptical. I worked in private sector in different tech companies, and I mean, I've personally heard messages of tech CEOs of non-European countries saying that, well, the EU might push forward those pieces of regulation and we might follow them in Europe, but we're not going to bring those trends this time and follow them elsewhere. I think Europe is taking a bit of a protectionist approach. And my problem with this is we regulate some of the things way in advance without ever having given those technologies a chance to develop. And in certain circumstances, it's good. I mean, when we look at AI, we never thought that the previous AI winters would evolve into something that we've seen over the past half a year. How the companies are racing towards AGI, artificial general intelligence, which if it was asked only a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, it was in a distant future. So now the companies are racing towards it. And the big tech company CEOs from Elon Musk or to historians such as Harari or technologists such as Jan Dallin are saying, please pause. We have to stop this. So in a sense that the EU is already having an AI regulation almost in place shows that we are regulating some of the things in advance as perhaps they should be. And with this specific legislation, the US has said that if the EU gets it right, we're going to apply the same rules in the US. But the DSA, the DMA, I fully agree with the goals of the Digital Services Act, of the Digital Markets Act. But for me personally, I don't think these are going to be the global trendsetters. I think the EU is trying to, with this protectionist effect, perhaps limit ourselves from partnerships with outside countries, which is problematic because the value chains, the supply chains can never be in one country or even in one area. And within the EU single market itself, we still have tons of barriers. And to some extent, the more legislation we have, sometimes we do create even more barriers than less barriers with those pieces of regulation. So my stand on this is not all of the legislation that comes out of the EU is going to be a global trend. And I have a colleague, a professor at one of the universities in Estonia, the leading technical university, who says that if you want to build the best technology in the world, you go to China. If you want to build the best business in the world, you go to the US. And if you want to build the most regulated services or products, you go to EU, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, as I mentioned TikTok earlier, TikTok has much different rules existing in China than it has for outside users. Perhaps we would want our users also to receive more educational content as opposed to addictive content. So we want to protect our minors. And in Europe, I mean, the DSA is going to regulate how minors are targeted to advertising. And China does have similar regulation, but it's not necessarily because we're a trendsetter. It's because they want to protect their minors too. So I'm very curious as to where we are going with this, I would even say, overabundance of legislation. I think the problem in Europe is that we never assess the cumulative administrative burden of these legislation on our companies. We see an individual effect of one legal act, be it GDPR, be it DMA, be it Data Act, be it just one piece of legislation. But we never assess the cumulative effect of all of those legislation. Because us in Europe, we still want to build the best businesses in the world as well. But if you are regulated to death before you can even start offering those services, I don't think this is a global trend that other countries want to follow.
We have Mr. Brando Benifei joining us. Thank you, Mr. Benifei, for joining us.
Hi.
He's a member in Artificial Intelligence Act, co-rapporteur. So let us get your perspective in. Mr. Benifei, we have discussed risk-based approaches to technical architecture, to some sort of business perspectives. So let me ask you this question. What are the primary considerations of the European Parliament's amendments to the AI Act, specifically with regard to consumer trust? What is this act going to do?
Well, yes, the idea behind the AI Act is to build more trust by consumers and citizens. In general, we think we cannot stand in a democracy to have distrust of technology based on lack of information, but also of an effective protection, so that we instead could see damage happening at some point, not being prevented, not being treated enough in terms of risk mitigation, and this would lead to a very bad reaction from the public. I think this is something we should avoid. This is the kind of society fractures that we see also in other democracies in the world. In the EU, we think we should try to build more cohesion around the usage of AI, and this means building trust. And to do this, we need to have a proper legislation which we try to build also in a way so that it could lead to a regulation effort at the global level. Obviously, it could also be not exactly the same, but it could have some similar elements. For example, I found a lot of interest talking with legislators all over the world about the risk-based approach that we have built around the AI Act that the Commission proposed and the Parliament have confirmed. The risk-based approach means that we are identifying high-risk AI or unbearable risk use cases of AI that we will prohibit. For example, biometric surveillance to some extent, we will see with the negotiations going on, some degree of emotion recognition, the social scoring, China style, etc. But also when we deal with health, security, children development, social rights, employment, we want certification of the use cases in a way that is looking at the quality of data used to train the AI, so that, for example, we fight the situation we live in today when we have AI systems related to employment, for example, for selection of curricula that discriminate systematically women because of the way they were trained. Just to give a very simple, very straightforward example. So, in terms of consumers and consumer trust, consumer opportunities, this legislation will try to mitigate and prevent risks with this certification of the risk-based approach, and also will provide consumers with some redress mechanism. The Parliament has been enhancing them in the proposal that we are making. So with a proper article about consumer redress and ability to act towards the national supervisory authorities. We think that this will lead to more protection for consumers, more legal certainty also for the businesses, and it will influence the rest of the world market. They will need to follow these rules, which in my view are not absurd, because we are concentrating on some AI systems. Many users will not be under the certification process because there must be a significant risk for health, safety, or fundamental rights. And this will be under the evaluation of the provider itself that will take responsibility on that. But in this way, we can really concentrate on what is really putting some risk and check if the mitigation has been done correctly. I think this is a good approach. We had some issues in including the new general purpose AI, especially the foundation models, the kind of GPT-4 and similar, but we adapted the original text of the Commission so that it can also deliver on these systems and not make them escape the regulation. So yeah, this can be some points about what you asked me.
Thank you. So let me just ask you a connected question before I go to Mark. So is there any consensus in European Parliament? What constitutes a high-risk AI? Are there any specific factors or parameters you're looking at? Let's say this is the high risk, there's no go area, you can go there.
Yeah, well, it's a combination of two elements. We have identified with the Annex 3 of the regulation areas that are potentially high risk. But we have a further filter because, as I mentioned earlier, there must be a significant risk, and we will have guidelines for that so that it can be identifiable by the provider what it means to have a significant risk in health, safety, or fundamental rights. We have put this further filter because if we just maintained that the areas in the Annex 3 will need to be under a certification process, this would have increased the number of use cases that will be under certification that would not be needed because there is no real risk. They are only pertaining an area that is potentially high risk. So we have put this filter, which has been a delicate balancing of different views. In the parliament, there were political factions that wanted more certification and others that wanted to limit it further than the proposal of the Commission. In this way, we try to build a balance that I think can make sense because we maintained an enlargement of the areas that are potentially high risk, for example, the democracy, but we have a filter so that there will be, with guidelines, a clear filtering of risk so that it needs to be a really significant risk for the procedure for mitigation with the certification process to take place. In this way, we try to reduce to the minimum the number of businesses that will have to follow this procedure, but we want to be sure that those that should do it will do it. And we have put enough, I think, safeguards so that this will happen and we can provide protection for consumers.
Thank you, Mr. Benifei. Let me go to Mr. Cankett. Mark, you have seen and heard from different panelists, different risk-based approaches to technical requirements, to AI requirements, to Sandra's argument that maybe soon legislations may not work. So how do you see firms working up and taking such a load for so many, let's say, compliances? Are they preparing for so much of scrutiny? What's their take? What's their view?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to regulation that is coming through the pipe, I think the Digital Services Act is a great example and a great sort of lens into how firms are preparing more broadly. But I think what I'm seeing is as a key initial step is the creation of multidisciplinary teams within firms, essentially standing up appropriate governance and oversight structures to consider the approach, the strategy for regulatory readiness. This is about engaging a broad church of stakeholders from across the organisation. For example, legal, compliance, trust and safety, product owners, internal audit, etc. But also keeping an eye to the external market. It's important because of the dynamic nature of what we're dealing with here that view of the external market is retained. So through whether that be professional advisors or engagement with think tanks or forums such as today's. But it's key now, and as I'm seeing with firms, to develop a regulatory readiness plan. And I spoke about audit and assurance earlier, and that should include, in the context of the DSA and the DMA, an audit readiness plan. And in the context of the timelines that are available, which, as we know, for certain regulations is pretty short. For example, the DSA audit is due for completion in August 2024. The time is to get going. The time is now to get going, rather. Firms' plans that I see are starting to consider the artifacts that should be created to evidence the framework that is in place to support the organisation's compliance with regulation. So many firms are interpreting that as needing to ensure that they are ready to evidence and articulate the policies, the procedures, the systems and controls that they have in place to address the detailed requirements of the regulation, many of which may be in operation already, but may not be readily demonstrable to either a regulator or an auditor in a clear and transparent way. Of course, some policies and procedures and controls may not actually exist at present or may require enhancement. And all of that needs to be identified and remediated as soon as possible and as far as possible before, in the context of the DSA audit, that work commences. And I think that if you think about the audit as a kind of vehicle for the scrutiny that firms will see, we're also seeing, and I'm seeing, firms prepare to validate by themselves their own policies and controls ahead of that outside scrutiny coming. Some referring to that as a mock audit. But I guess the point here is about attempting to surface any issues with the design or operation of policies, of controls, with sufficient time to fix any issues identified. Of course, that is challenging to get right in certain contexts with the timelines as they are. But I think another action would be thinking slightly further forward and to consider the approach to engagement with an auditor or with the Commission. How will information be shared and by whom? Will there be an operating model to support an efficient process around that? How would information be shared internally to management as findings are developed, as remediation is undertaken? And I guess as part of this, and with an eye to that external kind of dynamic landscape, how are you going to be monitoring as a firm those kind of external factors that are changing? So in respect to the DSA, I'm waiting with bated breath for the draft delegated acts in respect to the audit requirement. There are many areas of interpretation that are required across this regulation, across many of the articles. There are areas where further clarity would be very useful. So firms are thinking about those areas now for sure very carefully, and I would certainly champion kind of being ready to feed in a constructive way any kind of responses or feedback to consultations that are coming out. So the clock is ticking. It does make planning and preparation now for this regulation and for audit requirements a priority. I think it needs to be approached that, cognizant that we're not in a perfect world here. I think there'll be elements of firms' control environments that are potentially called out for improvement. And certainly in the context of a year one audit, that isn't an unusual thing. But I guess going forward, firms should be thinking about what is that more sustainable model to compliance with broader regulations they're subject to, thinking about how their overall framework can support compliance, rather than having multiple frameworks, one for DMA, one for DSA, etc. So yeah, my key message is really there's lots to do to prepare. Firms are certainly mobilizing. Planning and scoping is really critical here, as is, in the context of the audit, engagement with your chosen provider.
Thank you. And I think our clock is also ticking, and I think we have to end this conversation, such insightful conversation, great insights from Professor Wendehorst. I thank Ms. Särav, Ms. Adamczyk, and Mr. Cankett for such a broad overview of how can we navigate regulatory pathways, the larger European vision to, let's say, what businesses can do. And I think in India, we can also take those lessons, which we did from GDPR, and see how can we also contribute. Thank you very much. I'll give the mic and the floor back to the Ben. Thank you, organizers, for letting us in and chime in and give us these great speakers with insightful remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akash, and thank you, Sandra, Brando, Monika, and Christiane, and Mark. Was indeed very insightful and interestingly sort of diverse and I dare say conflicting sort of attitudes really to how much regulation is required, and where technologies should be regulated and what companies need to do, and the impact that it could have on stifling innovation or perceived protectionism by the EU. So all very, very interesting and complicated. So thank you all very much for sharing your expertise there. Plenty of food for thought for all of us there. So we're going to take a slightly longer break now, a 20-minute break before the next panel, which goes more into the sort of we've talked a lot about regulating the technologies, but we're getting more into the detail about regulating the companies themselves, the competition law and legislation side of things. The panel's about bridging barriers between competition and innovation. We've got speakers there from the European Commission, the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, the Spanish National Commission of Markets and Competition, and experts from Deloitte and the University of Oxford. It's going to be great. So please join us back at depending on where you are, but it's 20 minutes from now, 20 minutes from now. And of course, don't forget to keep the date in your calendar for the 26th of September for RAID Physical. Thank you all.